What's going on, everybody? We are back with another NFL mock draft. We are just, 2.5 weeks away from the actual NFL draft happening in late April, and I'm getting excited. This is going to be one of my last mock drafts. I think I'm going to have maybe one or two more before the draft itself, with a final predictive one maybe the day before. But nonetheless, let's get into it. We're going to have trades today of some capacity, although I think the fact that there hasn't been many trades in the draft so far in the first round is kind of an indicator of what's to come, in my opinion. I think a lot of people are forecasting major trades, especially at the top. I really don't see that happening. I have the feeling they were ironed out. They would be ironed out already. That's not to say if a guy slips or a guy, there's a team that feels like they need to jump another team in the teens. I think it could happen, certainly. I just think in the top seven or so, it's unlikely to happen. But we'll get into that. Maybe that's a forecasting of what to come. Who knows? Um, Tennessee at number one. It's just feeling like this is becoming more and more locked in before we even get to the draft. And I think they're going to end up taking Cam Ward out of Miami. They need a franchise quarterback. He's a mobile guy. He's a guy who I think is clearly has the highest ceiling in this draft. Um, I think you could argue between him and Shadeur Sanders, who's a better day one quarterback. But at the end of the day, that's not what you need him to be if you're Tennessee. You need him to be the quarterback of the future. And Will Levis is not the guy. I understand taking a generational talent like Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter. I shouldn't say generational because they're not generational necessarily. Although Travis Hunter, you can make an argument for, right? The ability to play both sides of the ball. I think the idea that you need a quarterback is really more important. And they clearly have an opening. They haven't signed a veteran this offseason. I think could change that, which we'll get to in just a moment. These next two picks, I think, really shape the draft, and I think we'll be drastically. The draft will be drastically affected by what happens here because either one of these teams could take a quarterback or both. Either one of these teams could avoid a quarterback or both. And so Cleveland, I think you have more of an argument for taking the best player available because I think there's not a great future necessarily, but you have more trust in the GM and the head coach going forward. Whereas the New York Giants, I think, might be more desperate to take a quarterback because Brian Dable and Joe Shane are on the hot seat. And, if you draft Shadeur Sanders and he looks decent, hey, your job, might be a little more secure, at least for the next season. That being said, I think Cleveland does end up going best player available, which you could argue whether it's Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter. I think they just won't pass up the idea of putting Abdul Carter on the opposite side of one Mr. Miles Garrett and just letting them eat. And that's what I'm going to go with here, taking Abdul Carter out of Penn State. And that leaves the Giants, I think, in a situation where they have to choose between two Colorado products. Is it Travis Hunter? Is it the best player available at a position where they do need in corner and could definitely use some help at wide receiver, considering it's pretty much Malik Neighbors and no one else. I mean, Sterling Shepard is what he is, but not even Sterling Shepard. I'm blanking on his name. Is not even that relevant here. The guy they just paid this past offseason, the amount of money they should have paid to Saquon Barkley. The question is really in my head, what is the smartest decision for the New York Giants? And I think that's what they're going to end up going with. Even if I mentioned Joe Shane is kind of on the hot seat, I just think at the end of the day, if they don't believe in the quarterback, they have to go with the best player available. And they signed two veterans. I think I've heard a lot of people say that has no effect on whether they take a quarterback. I do agree, but I think it may be an indicator in some capacity. Darius Slayton is the guy I was thinking of, by the way, not Sterling Shepard, obviously. They also have Wan'Dale Robinson there, who I think is a decent number three. And so if you add a guy like Travis Hunter, you play him on offense, you play him on defense until he can't anymore. I think he's just such an impact talent that you can't pass that up. Next up are the New England Patriots, certainly hoping that one of Travis Hunter or Abdul Carter get to them, and so therefore one of the Giants or the Browns take Shadeur Sanders. Unfortunately, not in this case. I think they shore up the offensive line here. They desperately need help at multiple positions. I think Will Campbell could end up playing multiple positions, whether he stays at tackle, whether he moves inside. I think either way, you feel good about that pick. I think he has the highest potential of these offensive linemen available, and I think that's what they need to do is really protect Drake May. I think that's what Mike Vrabel's going to do. Really also help establish the run game. Pick 5 for Jacksonville. I feel like this has been the worst kept secret. Mason Graham, I think, makes most sense as the pick here. a guy who could really, be that defensive stopper that Jacksonville has been looking for several years. Um, and I think they desperately need help on multiple positions on the defense. You could make an argument for an edge rusher, but certainly Mason Graham is the guy that you really would love to just shore up the interior of that defense. The Raiders at pick six. This one's interesting. I've seen so many mock drafts have Ashton Jeanty being picked here, and I can understand why. I mean, Pete Carroll obviously coming in, a guy who is, had Marshawn Lynch in Seattle as, that premier running back, and perhaps should have used him more in the Super Bowl. But at the end of the day, it's tough because running back is not as valuable as a position as it once was. That being said, we are seeing a swing now where running backs are becoming a little bit more valuable, especially with Saquon Barkley getting paid and then, really helping the Eagles get to the Super Bowl. He wasn't effective necessarily in the Super Bowl, but he was still pretty, decent enough. And he essentially got them there in large part with, running for 2,000 yards and nearly breaking the rushing record. The question is, do the Raiders find that valuable? Or is a guy like Teteroa McMillan, the wide receiver out of Arizona, enticing enough at also another position of need? Keep in mind. I mean, both of these are positions of need. Obviously, you have Jacoby Myers, but not a lot of wide receiver depth beyond that. I think the question is not necessarily which position is more valuable or which player is better. It's which player provides a better impact for your offense. And I think given the fact that the Raiders will definitely be run heavy, I think Ashton Jeanty would just be such a weapon for that offense. So I think that's where they end up going if they have the opportunity at six. At number seven for the Jets, this is an interesting pick, not just because I'm a Jets fan, but also for the fact that I think they could go two very different ways. They need another pass catcher, right? They have Garrett Wilson, they have the running backs, but past that, Tyler Conklin's gone. I mean, Alan Lazard's still there, sure, but Devontae Adams is gone. The addition of Tyler Warren would be good as an elite playmaker, and maybe you could argue that they should have taken Brock Bowers last year, and as good as Brock Bowers was, I'd argue taking an offensive tackle and shoring up that left tackle position was more important. But if you're drafting Membu, you're starting him at right tackle, which is significantly less important than your left tackle. However, given the fact that they paid Justin Fields to be their quarterback for at least a year, probably two, I think they're going to really focus on running the ball. And while Tyler Warren is a really good blocker, having those two bookend tackles in Membu and Fashanu for years to come, Fashanu for years to come, that's hard to pass up. I think that's where they end up going. And now you got all five starters locked in on the offensive line. I think that's where they end up going. So I'm taking Armand Membu here, offensive tackle out of Missouri. Carolina at pick eight, I think could go a number of ways. Unlike the previous teams, I think they're not down to two options. I think they could go edge rusher. They could certainly need a wide receiver. Really, any position on defense could certainly use help. I could even see them, adding a piece on the offensive line. The question is, I think where you need to upgrade the most, and I think that's on the defensive line. And we've seen a lot of flirting between Jalen Walker and the Panthers. We've seen kind of a lot of rumors that that's where they're going to go. I just feel like that's where they're going to end up going, adding a real impact pass rusher, a guy who I think could really make an impact for their defense. New Orleans at pick nine. I think this is where the Shadeur Sanders slide stops. You can make an argument for a team trading up before this, certainly. But at the end of the day, I think New Orleans feels it that Derek Carr is not the future, right? And they paid him, and they're certainly in a horrible financial situation with him and everyone else in the entire roster. But you get a guy in Shadeur who you could put on the backup spot. You don't have to start him right away. Derek Carr's your guy, and I mean, honestly, Carr misses time pretty much every season, so you get Shadeur Sanders some action. There's not a lot of pressure for him, and he's the future for your offense. I think that's a reasonable pick. Now, I certainly could see them adding a piece on the defense or on the offensive line, but I think Shadeur Sanders stops the slide here. Chicago at pick 10. Now, if I will say with Chicago, if Ashton Jeanty was on the board, or if there's an opportunity to trade up in front of the Raiders, I think that could definitely be a possibility. A team like the Patriots could certainly trade down, especially if Travis Hunter or Abdul Carter are not on the board, right? Which they weren't at four, but they didn't here, and so I think they end up taking the best offensive linemen to really help shore up that offensive line. They made a lot of moves on the interior, adding a guy like Kelvin Banks who could play tackle, who could play inside, just gives you another option. At pick 11 for the San Francisco 49ers, they're definitely going defense here, in my opinion. Will Johnson would be a great addition, especially with Robert Saleh back. I could see, that being really a focus. Javarius Ward out the door. You know, adding a guy like Will Johnson on the outside, I think could be fun for that defense. Then again, Shamar Stewart rushing the passer, Mykel Williams rushing the passer, I think would be fun too. I think they end up going corner here. The question is just which one. And I have him taking Will Johnson here out of Michigan. I think he, in my opinion, has the highest ceiling, and I think he's just a Robert Saleh guy. He just feels like that, man. As a Jets fan, seeing what Robert Saleh values, how excited he was to get Sauce Gardner in the building, I think Will Johnson could be a similar vibe there. Pick 12 for the Dallas Cowboys. Listen, I think the Cowboys would be thrilled to be in this position to have Tet McMillan fall to them. To be able to have him as your second wide receiver behind CeeDee Lamb, I think would be a perfect situation for them. That big body on the outside with CeeDee Lamb running the slot, which I think is where he's best. It would just be a dynamic 1-2 punch. Miami at pick 13, probably hoping, that a guy like Will Johnson is still on the board, but I could still see them going with a guy like Jahdae Barron out of Texas. Um, really an impact defender. I think they need that on the back end. Their secondary was not so great. They lose Javon Holland to the New York Giants. Adding a guy like Barron on the secondary, I think, could certainly help. Indianapolis at pick 14. I think Tyler Warren sliding to them would be also one of their best case scenarios. Having a guy, just a great all around tight end, and him falling all the way to 14, I think Indy would be thrilled. I could see them trading up if they feel like he's the guy, certainly. And of course, that opportunity is there. The Atlanta Falcons. Have to check my notes. I don't remember where I went here. I remember I went edge rusher because after 4 straight years of drafting offensive players, whether it's Kyle Pitts or Drake London or Bijan Robinson or last year Michael Penix Jr., they need help on the defense desperately. That was clear. They could not get to the quarterback. They could not. And adding a guy like Mykel Williams out of Georgia, he doesn't have to travel far. I think is the best fit for them. I think it'd be hilarious if they went offense just for the fun of it, but I think they desperately need help on that defense with Raheem Morris there. I think he just can't pass up a defensive player for I don't know how many year in a row. I mean, he obviously it wasn't him in the previous seasons before last, but I think this is the time for them to go get that impact defensive player. Next up with the Arizona Cardinals, I just have the feeling a guy like Mike Green might go higher than we expect. I think the target is edge rusher here, certainly. Similar to Atlanta, they could not get to the quarterback last year. Question is Mike Green or Shamar Stewart. In my heart of hearts, I think Shamar Stewart's a better player, but I could just see Mike Green rising up draft boards, and I think that's where they'll go here. And I think for a team like Cincinnati, who just saw two edge rushers go in the picks before them in Mykel Williams and Mike Green, having a guy like Shamar Stewart available, especially when you don't know what's going to happen with Hendrickson, you add Shamar Stewart to that defensive line, whether you keep Hendrickson or not. I think the Bengals are just in such a good position there to have that fall to them that they just can't pass it up. Um, Shamar Stewart's the pick for them for sure. Next up, the Seattle Seahawks. Um, the question is, I like Matthew Golden. That's the suggestion here. I could see them upgrading interior offensive line, certainly. Getting a guy like Josh Simmons and moving him inside could make sense. Tyler Booker, I don't hate. Gray Zabel, I don't hate. Uh, I think given these options, they'd go Matthew Golden here. You lose DK Metcalf, you bring in Cooper Kupp, who's not a huge upgrade. You obviously don't have Tyler Lockett anymore. I think Golden would be the pick here because he's essentially your second wide receiver, depending on how quickly Cooper Kupp is losing it. They think he hasn't lost it given the contract they gave him. But maybe Matthew Golden's your three. But either way, I feel like that's a good developmental pick. Guy you could pair with JSN for the future. I don't hate it. Tampa Bay at pick 19. I mentioned trades, and we haven't seen one yet, but I think this is a perfect spot for one, especially with Matthew Golden off the board, who I think Tampa could certainly target. The Chargers, I think, desperately need a pass catcher. And having a guy like Colston Leveland where he's at, and a team like Denver and pick 20, I know they grabbed Evan Ingram, but I don't think that prevents them from grabbing a guy like Loveland to play on the opposite side. I think the Chargers would be willing to hop over the division mate, trade with Tampa Bay, and make that deal happen. So let me pull up here some Tampa Bay Buccaneers, oops, excuse me, and some LA Chargers. And I'm not too focused on the package here. Maybe it's the second round and then Tampa gives up the third round. Maybe that's what it looks like. I think that's probably equivalent value considering Tampa's probably only trading back 3 spots, but I'm not trying to design a perfect trade here. The recuperation is not as important in my mind. What's important is the fact that the Chargers are moving up to 19 and they're getting their guy in Colston Loveland, Michigan product, right? Jim Harbaugh gets this guy, and you desperately need pass catchers on this offense, man. I know, Lad McConkey played well last year. You bring a Mike Williams back. Maybe Luther Burden is a guy they target here, a little bit further down the rankings on this, or Emeka Egbuka certainly could be an option. I don't hate either of those picks, but I think with Colston Leveland being the weapon that he is, and the fact that I think Denver could certainly target him, and just to pick later, and they're in your division, I think that makes a lot of sense. Denver at pick 20, certainly not happy that Colston Leveland's off the board, but the question is, do they go offense? I don't think they do necessarily if Loveland's not there. Adding Kenneth Grant to that defensive line rotation would be a lot of fun. Having him play opposite John Franklin Myers, perhaps in a similar role where they're playing, interior on passing downs and exterior on rushing downs. I think that could be an option. I think he's just another addition to that Sean Payton defense that makes it a lot of fun. Pittsburgh at pick 21. Um, the question here for me is not, how do I say this? A quarterback is a need here listed, right? And that's because they don't have great options, right? It's Mason Rudolph. That is also because Aaron Rodgers is still out there and the Pittsburgh Steelers are hoping for him and I think are very likely to sign him. That being said, Aaron Rodgers is 41 years old. I think Mike Tomlin is realistic. And I think Mike Tomlin, if he loves a guy at the quarterback position, I think he could target him. Is Jaxson Dart that guy? I'm going to say yes. I think Jaxson Dart could end up going top 15 in this draft. I think Jaxson Dart could end up going second round in this draft. His rise and fall is one I'm interested to watch, especially with not that many landing spots in the back half, right? Of the first round, that is. Maybe some teams that are willing to trade up, like the Giants, who didn't get a quarterback, like the Jets, maybe. Various other options in the top of the draft. And maybe the Cleveland Browns, but they obviously wouldn't trade with Pittsburgh, obviously. But I think in its simplicity, Pittsburgh needs to upgrade the position. And Aaron Rodgers, while I think he could be good for a 1 year stint, maybe two if you're incredibly lucky, Jaxson Dart could be the future. And if you bench him for 2 years because Aaron Rodgers is great, who cares? That's probably fantastic. That's probably a fantastic outcome. Tampa Bay at pick 22. Listen, Tampa Bay was at pick 19. They would have probably targeted a guy like Jihad Campbell or one of these safeties or James Pierce. And all of these options are still on the board. Maybe the Kenneth Grant would have been the pick. I don't think so necessarily. Adding a pass rusher like Jihad Campbell, who I think has a talent to go top 15, I think Tampa considers that a win, considering they moved so far up in the second round in this scenario. Pick 23 for the Green Bay Packers. I think probably hoping Jihad Campbell made it to them. James Pierce Jr. is not a bad consolation prize. You definitely need help on that defensive line in Green Bay. Pierce is a great addition. Safety for the Minnesota Vikings. It's just where I think they're going to end up going. Um, Almost every mock draft I've seen has them taking a safety. They certainly needed help on their defense. Harrison Smith's getting older. A guy like Malachi Starks to that defensive backfield. I mean, even Nick Emanwari I think would be fun. Could also see additions on the defensive line. So that's not out of the question. A guy like Derek Harmon, Walter Nolan certainly. I think could make even Ezraku. I think could make his way up. Although edge rusher is not as much of a need for them. But I think Malachi Starks is the pick here. I think it's a no-brainer. Houston at pick 25. Houston. They need help on their offensive line, man, and I think they already needed help before they traded away Larry Tunsil. Adding a guy like Josh Simmons, who I think could play tackle, unlike some of the tackles in this class that I think are going to end up moving inside. I think Simmons is a true tackle. You hope he survives because replacing Laramie Tunsil is harder to do. The Rams at pick 26. This one's fun. Um, I think they could go a number of positions. I think the defensive backfield certainly needs help, but I can't resist adding a guy like Luther Burden to this offense. And you have him. He's your third wide receiver, right? You have Puka Nacua. You have Devontae Adams. I mean, similar to the Seattle situation, you have Luther Burden as your third wide receiver. And you're not putting a lot of pressure on him, but you're developing him behind two studs. And a guy in Devontae Adams who's probably not got that too much left on his career, maybe 2 or 3 years. You have Luther Burden in the wings ready to take over. I love that. Baltimore at pick 27. Could go a number of ways here. I think Baltimore's always one of the teams that's hardest to predict. But I do think with Amion Mori available, I mean, having him opposite of Kyle Hamilton in your safety position, I think would be fun. I think that's where they end up going with these options. Detroit at pick 28. This could be a trade up spot, certainly, if a team is in love with a certain player. I just feel like Detroit's always the team that ends up doing it. But at the end of the day, they do need defensive line help. Who that is, if it's Derek Harmon, if it's Walter Nolan. But offensive line is also a need for them. I think Gray Zabel is really a Dan Campbell guy. I think that's where they're going to end up going. I mean, I could certainly see them adding a defensive lineman, right, pairing with Aiden Hutchinson, especially with Hutchinson coming back from injury. I think that could be really helpful for their pass rush. But Dan Campbell's team is built on offensive line, and Gray Zabel, I think, is such a Dan Campbell guy, right? Tough, physical. Yeah, I could see it. Washington at pick 29. It's interesting to me to see how far Amarian Hampton has kind of risen up draft boards. Originally, it was Ashton Chanty being the only projected first round running back, and now Amarian Hampton's in that category. And, Washington needs help at the running back position. I think they need another offensive weapon, certainly. Terry McLaurin was very good, obviously. But whether it was Zach Ertz or Luka McCaffrey or whoever else, I didn't really believe in their offensive weapons. I mean, the running back position was decent, right? Austin Eckler played pretty well. Obviously, you got I'm blanking on his name, Brian Robinson. There we go. But I think Amarian Hampton could just be another weapon for them out of the backfield. I think that's where they end up going here. Although Emeka Egbuka is certainly enticing. Um, Next up, the Buffalo Bills are kind of one of those teams I feel like similar to the Lions is prone to trade back. They definitely need defensive line help. I think they need it every year. While Walter Nolan is interesting, I think Eziraku feels more like a Buffalo Bill pick, just a pure talent perspective. Kind of focus instead of kind of the more polished guy. I think that's where they would end up going with those options. Kansas City Chiefs. Listen, it's not listed as one of their suggestions here on this NFL mock draft database simulator, but it's hard for me to pass up Emeka Egbuka here. Chiefs need an outside wide receiver, and you add a guy like Egbuka, who I think could play numerous positions on the offense. I think he could play in the slot. I think he could play on the outside. You add him with Rashee Rice coming back from injury, and oh my gosh, I'm blanking on names tonight. Xavier Worthy, obviously, the speedster on the edge. I just think you got to keep adding offensive weapons here, especially with Travis Kelce not clearly not being the weapon that he once was. I think Igbuka is a great addition for them. And then Philadelphia, I think certainly having Tyler Booker, as an offensive line option would help, especially losing Mekhi Becton to free agency. Walter Nolan is hard to pass up, though, man. They love their SEC defensive players. How I stuck at 32? Man, I guess they go Tyler Booker here and just plan to play him at right guard. I think that's probably their best option. Although I hate leaving Walter Nolan. I think he's clearly a first round talent. But it is what it is. Whoever's at 33, which I believe is the Browns. Yeah, it's Browns, Giants, then Titans, I believe, in the start of the second. I don't know that they go Abdul Carter, Walter Nolan. So maybe Walter Nolan drops to the Giants at 34. That'd be interesting. Nonetheless, we're done with our first round mock. Obviously, had the solo trade, but Cam Ward going Titans first overall. Giants going Travis Hunter. Patriots shoring up that offensive line. Ashton Genty providing a weapon in Vegas. Shadeur end up going to New Orleans, not changing team colors from Georgia to New Orleans. I think we had a few of those too. I noticed across the board. Ted McMillan providing another weapon in Dallas. Tyler Warren in Indy. I mean, edge rushers galore in the middle of this draft. Look at that. Michael Williams, Mike Green, Shamar Stewart back to back to back. Tight ends and quarterbacks at the back half of the round. Jaxson Dart going to the Steelers. Malachi Starks shoring up the back end of that defense. Same with him and Worry in Baltimore. Oops, I don't know why that jumped. That's weird. The team's shoring up the offensive line certainly with Simmons going to the Houston, Gray Zabel, Detroit, Tyler Booker, Philly, and maybe two of the most exciting pick or three of the most exciting picks of the draft here with Luther Burden going to the Rams, Omarion Hampton going to the Commanders, and then Emeka Egbuka going to the Chiefs. But nonetheless, this was an NFL mock draft for the first round. Let me know what you think. Do you think these picks are realistic? Do you think Shadeur Sanders ends up going 9 or sooner? That's, I think, the biggest question. I think he could end up going as soon as 2. I think he could end up slipping his back as far as 20. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Did you have any different picks? Do you think we should do something different for the next mock? Let me know in the comments. I appreciate the support. Peace out.